When a desperate single father's daughter faced death, a mysterious billionaire stepped in, but the life-saving miracle came with a shocking test that would change everything. James Carter had always believed that life was full of challenges, but nothing had prepared him for the storm that had descended upon his small family. Living in a modest apartment in a crowded neighborhood, James's days were a continuous struggle. He worked long hours as a delivery driver, often waking up before dawn and returning home late at night, exhausted and aching. But despite the fatigue, he never let his daughter, Mia, feel the weight of their financial struggles. She was 7 years old, with bright, curious eyes and a smile that could light up the darkest room. For James, Mia was everything: his anchor, his joy, and the reason he kept pushing through each grueling day. Life hadn't been easy for James. After losing his wife in a car accident 2 years earlier, he had become both mother and father to Mia. The grief had been unbearable, but he had thrown himself into raising her, determined to give her a childhood filled with love, warmth, and laughter. Still, the bills kept piling up, and the world often felt unkind. He had taken any job he could find, working at a grocery store, driving for a rideshare service, even helping neighbors with odd jobs just to make ends meet. But nothing seemed enough. The rent, utilities, groceries, and Mia's school expenses left him exhausted and frustrated. Yet he never complained. James carried the weight of their struggles silently, knowing that Mia deserved more than sorrow or stress in her young life. One day, James noticed something unusual in Mia. She had been more tired than usual, complaining of stomach pains and persistent headaches. At first, he thought it was just the stress of school, or perhaps something she had eaten. But as the days went on, her condition worsened. She became pale, weak, and increasingly withdrawn, unable to enjoy the little joys she once loved, like drawing or playing outside. Panic began to creep into James's heart. He knew that something was seriously wrong. But as a single father with limited resources, getting medical help was not easy. After several frantic calls, visits to local clinics, and endless waiting in overcrowded hospitals, Mia was finally diagnosed with a rare and severe illness. The doctor's words hit James like a thunderbolt. Without urgent treatment, Mia might not survive. Fear and helplessness gripped him. He felt like the ground had vanished beneath his feet, leaving him in a terrifying void. Tears blurred his vision as he held his daughter in his arms, whispering promises to keep her safe, even though he had no idea how he could. The enormity of the situation overwhelmed him. He had always been her protector, her hero, and now he felt powerless, staring at a reality where he might lose the most precious person in his life. Determined not to give up, James began searching for every possible treatment, every experimental drug, and every doctor who might offer hope. He spent hours researching online, reading medical journals, joining support groups, and contacting specialists across the country. But the treatments were expensive, and the doctors were either fully booked or hesitant to try unproven methods. With each passing day, James watched Mia grow weaker, and with it, his hope began to waver. He questioned whether he was doing enough, whether he had failed as a father, and whether life had been unfair to them both. Despite the crushing weight of despair, James refused to let Mia see his fear. He forced a smile when tucking her into bed, telling her bedtime stories with animated voices and exaggerated gestures to make her laugh. He cooked small meals even when he was too tired to eat himself, and sang softly to her at night, praying that somehow some miracle would save her. His love for Mia was boundless, and it fueled his determination to fight, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. Friends and neighbors often offered words of encouragement, but James could see the worry in their eyes, a reflection of the reality he couldn't ignore. He felt alone, battling an impossible situation with only his love for Mia as armor. Financial stress added to the emotional turmoil. The mounting hospital bills threatened to consume whatever little savings James had. He juggled multiple jobs, sometimes working through the night, barely sleeping, constantly worrying about how to cover the next medical expense. Each missed payment, each reminder notice, was a reminder of the fragility of their existence. But giving up was not an option. James had learned to survive through hardship, and now survival wasn't just for him, it was for Mia in the evenings. When the apartment grew quiet and the city sounds dimmed, James would sit beside Mia's bed, holding her hand and watching her breathe. He would recount memories of her mother, stories of laughter, hope, and resilience, trying to instill in her a sense of security and love. Every giggle, every small smile from Mia felt like a victory, a tiny light in the overwhelming darkness. And even though the path ahead seemed impossible, James clung to the hope that somehow they would find a way through this nightmare. James's life was a relentless series of sacrifices. He missed social events, skipped meals, and put aside his own health. All for Mia. He became a master of multitasking, navigating the delicate balance between work, care, and emotional support. His body ached, his mind was exhausted, yet his determination never faltered. James's world had shrunk to the size of his apartment and the fragile life of his daughter. Yet within that small space, love and courage grew stronger than fear, even as despair threatened to consume him. James never let himself be defeated. He believed in miracles, in the kindness of strangers, and in the power of love. Little did he know that a miracle, unlike any he had imagined, was about to enter their lives, bringing hope, danger, and a twist of fate that would change everything. But for now, James's days were filled with worry, struggle, and tireless devotion, a single father's unyielding fight to save his daughter, no matter the cost. James Carter's life had been consumed by worry and endless nights of sleepless panic. But one chilly autumn morning, a flicker of hope appeared in the most unexpected form. It started with a phone call. The voice on the other end was calm, almost unnervingly composed, introducing himself as Alexander Whitmore, a billionaire CEO whose name James had only ever seen in magazines and online business articles. Alexander explained that he had seen a news story about Mia, a brave little girl fighting against a rare illness, and he wanted to help. At first, James laughed bitterly to himself, thinking it was some kind of scam. Why would a billionaire care about a struggling father and his sick daughter? Despite his skepticism, James couldn't ignore the small voice inside him telling him to listen. Alexander's offer was unlike anything James could have imagined. He promised access to an experimental treatment that could potentially save Mia's life. A treatment that was not available to the public and had shown incredible results in early trials. The procedure was highly advanced, using innovative techniques that were still in development, and Alexander insisted on personally overseeing Mia's care. James felt a surge of hope, quickly followed by fear and disbelief. How could this stranger offer something so incredible? What was the catch? After days of researching Alexander Whitmore, his companies, and his history, James reluctantly agreed to meet him in person. When he entered the towering, glass-walled office in downtown New York City, he felt completely out of place. James, dressed in worn jeans and a simple shirt, looked around at the sleek, minimalist office filled with futuristic gadgets, high-tech screens, and an air of wealth and power that was both inspiring and intimidating. Alexander greeted him with a warm yet enigmatic smile. There was a calm confidence in the man, a presence that made James feel both small and strangely safe. Alexander spoke directly to James, not just as a CEO, but as someone who seemed to understand the fear and desperation of a father trying to save his child. He explained the treatment in detail, walking James through every step, every risk, and every potential outcome. He was candid, showing both the promise and the dangers. James listened, torn between hope and anxiety, realizing that this could be the only chance Mia had. The offer was extraordinary, bordering on unbelievable. Yet there was a sincerity in Alexander's voice that made James decide to trust him. The following weeks were a whirlwind of tests, appointments, and preparation. Mia, unaware of the gravity of her situation, remained the cheerful, curious child she had always been. James tried to keep her spirits high, but he often felt the weight of despair pressing down on him, especially at night when the apartment was silent and still. Finally, the day came when Mia was admitted to Alexander's private medical facility, state-of-the-art center unlike any hospital James had ever seen. The walls were bright and welcoming, the equipment advanced and precise, and the doctors highly skilled. It felt more like a sanctuary than a hospital. The treatment itself was a tense, emotional journey. James stayed by Mia's side through every step, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement, and promising that she would be okay. The procedures were long and complex, requiring careful monitoring and precise execution. There were moments of fear when alarms went off or when Mia's condition fluctuated. But Alexander remained calm, guiding James and reassuring him that everything possible was being done. Slowly, gradually, Mia began to show signs of improvement. Her color returned, her energy grew, and her bright smile, which James feared he would never see again, began to shine once more. Throughout this process, James observed Alexander closely. The billionaire was unlike anyone James had ever met. There was no arrogance, no condescension, only a deep, almost unsettling focus on the task at hand. Alexander was meticulous, personally checking on Mia's progress daily, ensuring that everything was perfect. He treated James with respect, acknowledging the father's devotion and sacrifice. Yet, there was a certain mystery about him that James could not unravel. Who was this man who had the power to change lives with the wave of a hand, and yet chose to focus on one sick little girl in a tiny apartment across the city? As Mia's condition stabilized, James felt an overwhelming mixture of relief, gratitude, and suspicion. The nightmare of seeing her suffer had lifted, replaced by a cautious optimism. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to dream of a future where Mia could run, laugh, and grow up without fear of illness. He watched her play in the facility's garden, her laughter echoing through the halls, and felt a joy he thought he had lost forever. Alexander, standing quietly nearby, seemed pleased yet distant. As if he had his own reasons for intervening, reasons James could not yet understand. Despite the miracle of the treatment, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Alexander's interest in Mia seemed genuine, but it was paired with an intensity that suggested a larger purpose. During casual conversations, Alexander hinted at opportunities and responsibilities that James could scarcely imagine. The billionaire spoke of a world where the power to help others was limitless, where people could rise above their circumstances with the right guidance and resources. But there was also a challenge hidden in his words, a test perhaps, that James could not fully grasp in the quiet moments alone with Mia. James reflected on how drastically his life had changed in such a short time. From endless worry and desperation, he had been thrust into a world of wealth, advanced medicine, and possibilities he had never dared to consider. The gratitude he felt toward Alexander was immense, yet it was tinged with unease. How had this man found them? Why had he chosen to help them out of all the families in the city, in the country, maybe even the world? James knew that every miracle came with a cost, and he braced himself for what that cost might be. As Mia's recovery continued, James began to allow himself a small sense of normalcy. He laughed again, hugged his daughter without fear, and even allowed himself to hope. He saw the change in her energy, the sparkle returning to her eyes, and he marveled at the resilience of a child whose spirit had been tested so young. Alexander's presence, while still mysterious, had become a source of reassurance. The billionaire's involvement had turned what seemed like an impossible battle into a fight with a real chance of victory. But even amid this relief and happiness, James's instincts told him that Alexander's plan was far from ordinary. There was an intensity, a careful observation in the man's eyes, that suggested this intervention was not entirely altruistic. James couldn't yet comprehend what lay ahead. But he knew that Mia's life had been saved, and for that, he was willing to follow this strange, enigmatic benefactor wherever it might lead. What had begun as a desperate search for a miracle had transformed into an entirely new chapter of his life, one filled with hope, uncertainty, and the subtle hint of an extraordinary plan that Alexander Whitmore had set into motion. After Mia's recovery, James Carter felt as if a huge weight had been lifted off his shoulders. The fear that had shadowed every moment of his life, the dread of losing his daughter, was finally replaced by a fragile sense of hope. But just as he began to believe that their lives could return to some semblance of normal, Alexander Whitmore appeared again, this time with a presence that felt both reassuring and unsettling. James had grown to trust the billionaire in the past weeks, but there was something in Alexander's eyes now that hinted at a deeper purpose. Something beyond simply saving a child. One quiet afternoon, Alexander invited James to his office once more. This time, the atmosphere was different. The office, always sleek and imposing, now felt like the stage for a carefully planned conversation. Alexander began by congratulating James on how he had handled the crisis, praising the father's unwavering devotion and courage. James, humbled and still wary, listened quietly. Alexander's words were flattering, but James sensed that praise was only the beginning. He noticed a subtle shift in the billionaire's tone, intensity that suggested an agenda he was about to reveal. Alexander leaned forward, his eyes locking onto James's with a seriousness that made the air feel heavy. He spoke of his Vizuna, global initiative aimed at changing the lives of families living in hardship. Families like James and Mia. Alexander explained that he wanted to launch a program that combined innovation, philanthropy, and social responsibility. But to do so, he needed participants who could be trusted, who could act with integrity, resilience, and courage in real-world situations. In short, he needed James. At first, James didn't understand. "Me?" he asked, incredulous. "Why would you want someone like me?" Alexander's answer was simple, yet unnerving. He explained that he had observed James during Mia's illness and seen qualities he valued: strength under pressure, selflessness, courage in the face of despair. Alexander said that these qualities were rare, and that James could play a critical role in a project designed to test human character and ethical decision-making. A project that would shape how the wealthy could directly impact the lives of those who struggled most. James was stunned. The offer seemed almost impossible to comprehend. On one hand, it was an incredible opportunity, a chance not only to secure a future for Mia, but also to participate in something larger than life, something that could change the world. On the other hand, the weight of responsibility and the ambiguity of what Alexander was asking made James uneasy. He realized that nothing in his past had prepared him for this. The billionaire's plan sounded extraordinary, but it also hinted at moral and ethical challenges that James could barely imagine. Alexander explained that James would not be just a participant, but an active player in a series of real-life situations that would test his principles in decision-making. These situations would be carefully orchestrated, some obvious, some subtle, to see how James would respond under pressure when faced with difficult choices that could affect others' lives. The goal, Alexander said, was not merely to help people, but to understand what drives human behavior when morality, survival, and opportunity collide. James listened, feeling a mixture of awe and fear. The plan was brilliant, yet unnerving. It was as if Alexander was inviting him into a game where the rules were invisible and the stakes were high. The offer came with promises that were tempting beyond measure. Alexander assured James that Mia's education, health, and future would be fully secured, that they would live without fear of financial insecurity, and that they would have access to opportunities most people could only dream of. But alongside these promises came the understanding that James would have to navigate situations that were morally ambiguous, that could challenge his integrity, and test his instincts as a father, a man, and a human being. The more James considered it, the more he realized that accepting the offer meant stepping into a world he had never known, a world filled with power, influence, and unknown consequences. Over the next few days, James thought deeply about the proposition. He discussed it with Mia in simple terms, trying to gauge her feelings without frightening her. He replayed conversations with Alexander in his mind, analyzing every detail, every nuance. He knew that the opportunity could secure a life of comfort and opportunity for Mia, yet he also feared losing himself in the process. There was a subtle tension in James's heart, a struggle between desire and principle, hope and caution. Finally, James agreed to participate. Not because he fully understood what lay ahead, but because he saw no other path that could guarantee Mia's safety and happiness. He trusted Alexander in part because the billionaire had proven his commitment through action. saving Mia's life when it seemed impossible. But he also trusted himself, knowing that he had the strength to face challenges, to navigate complexity, and to make decisions guided by love, responsibility, and morality. The first stage of Alexander's plan began subtly. James was asked to assist in community projects designed to test his empathy and leadership. On the surface, these tasks seemed ordinary: organizing charity events, mentoring children, helping families in need, but there were layers to each assignment that revealed how James responded under pressure. He quickly discovered that Alexander's tests were not about physical endurance or technical skill. They were about character. James had to make decisions that weighed personal comfort against ethical responsibility. Often in situations that had no clear right or wrong answer, one assignment required James to mediate a dispute between two families who were competing for limited resources, testing his ability to remain fair and compassionate under stress. Another placed him in a situation where he had to choose between taking a lucrative opportunity that benefited him personally or prioritizing the needs of a struggling family. Each challenge was designed to stretch his moral judgment, forcing him to examine his values in real time. James learned quickly that these tests were not just theoretical. They affected real people, and the consequences of his decisions were immediate and tangible. As James progressed, he began to notice a change within himself. He felt more confident in making tough choices, more aware of the consequences of his actions, more capable of balancing love, responsibility, and principle. At the same time, he could sense that Alexander was watching closely, guiding, observing, and subtly influencing outcomes. There was an intensity in the billionaire's presence, a reminder that this was more than philanthropy. It was a calculated experiment in human behavior. Despite the unusual nature of the assignments, James could see the benefits for Mia. She was thriving in an environment of care, curiosity, and opportunity, and James began to imagine a future where she could grow up safely and happily. Yet the shadow of uncertainty remained. Alexander's plan was brilliant but enigmatic, and James knew that the challenges ahead would be even more complex and demanding by the end of this phase. James understood that his life had changed forever. He had been saved from despair by Alexander's intervention, but now he was part of a larger, almost unimaginable journey. The billionaire's plan was not just about saving a child. It was about shaping a man, testing his limits, and revealing the true potential of someone who had known hardship, love, and unwavering devotion. James realized that he had stepped into a world where the rules were unspoken. The stakes were high, and every choice carried weight. And as he looked at Mia, laughing and playing, he knew that he would face whatever came next, not for himself, but for her, and for the possibility of doing something extraordinary with his life. As James Carter continued to follow Alexander Whitmore's carefully designed plan, he began to realize just how complex and challenging the billionaire's world really was. What had started as a simple chance to secure Mia's health and future devolved into something far more demanding, something that tested every part of him: his courage, his judgment, his patience, and most importantly, his moral compass. Each assignment Alexander presented wasn't just about helping others or learning skills. It was about pushing James to his limits, forcing him to confront choices he had never imagined he would have to make. The first major challenge arrived one morning in a quiet meeting room. Alexander explained that James would need to participate in a high-stakes negotiation involving several struggling families who were competing for scarce resources. The catch was that the situation had been deliberately structured so that there was no clear right decision. Every choice James made would benefit some people while potentially harming others. As the room filled with tension, James felt a familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. He knew that, unlike the challenges he had faced with Mia, these choices were not about survival. They were about fairness, ethics, and human behavior. James listened carefully as the families voiced their concerns, frustrations, and needs. Some were desperate, pleading for assistance to feed their children or pay for medical care. Others were frustrated, accusing their neighbors of hoarding resources or manipulating the system. James felt torn. Every solution he proposed seemed to please some while upsetting others. He realized that his every word and action carried weight far beyond what he had expected. For the first time in his life, James experienced the uncomfortable reality of making decisions where no perfect answer existed, where the right choice was not always clear, and where consequences were immediate and visible. Alexander observed quietly from across the room. There was no interference, no guidance, just an intense focus on James, a silent reminder that this was both a test and a lesson. James felt the pressure more keenly because Alexander's gaze reminded him that every choice was being evaluated. He thought about Mia, her bright eyes and innocent laughter, and it struck him how important it was to remain honest and true to his principles. He realized that these challenges were more than exercises, they were mirrors, reflecting who he was and the values he carried as the negotiation ended. James had made difficult choices that left some people satisfied and others disappointed. It was not perfect, and he knew it. Yet he also realized that he had handled the situation with integrity, compassion, and a willingness to take responsibility for outcomes that were beyond his control. Alexander nodded approvingly afterward, a small, enigmatic smile on his face, signaling that James had passed this stage of the test. But James also sensed that this was only the beginning. Alexander's challenges would grow in complexity and difficulty, and the moral dilemmas would become more personal. The next stage of the plan pushed James even further. Alexander asked him to consider opportunities that involve personal gain versus collective benefit. A wealthy business partner had offered James a chance to invest in a project that would bring enormous profit, but doing so would mean ignoring the needs of a family in crisis. In a situation similar to James's own past struggles, the decision tore at him. On one hand, the money could secure Mia's entire future, allowing her every opportunity imaginable. On the other, the family in need had no way to protect themselves, and James felt a sense of responsibility. He wrestled with the choice for days, pacing the apartment late at night, staring at Mia asleep, imagining her life with and without the consequences of his decision. Finally, James made his choice. He prioritized the family in need, refusing the immediate profit that could have made life easier for him and Mia. It was one of the hardest decisions he had ever made, but he felt a sense of peace afterward. James realized that true strength wasn't about wealth or opportunity, it was about doing the right thing, even when it was difficult and when no one was watching. Alexander, once again observing silently, seemed satisfied. He didn't offer praise or judgment, only the quiet presence that reminded James that his journey was far from over. As the weeks passed, the challenges became more emotionally taxing. Alexander introduced scenarios that tested James's patience, empathy, and loyalty. In one exercise, James was asked to mentor a young boy who reminded him of Mia Bright. Curious, but struggling with family issues and poverty, James poured himself into helping the child, teaching him skills, offering guidance, and listening patiently to his fears. Yet Alexander also introduced subtle temptations, moments where James could take shortcuts, abandon his responsibility, or even manipulate the child for personal gain. Each time James resisted, but the internal struggle left him exhausted. He realized that Alexander's tests weren't just about external decisions, they were about examining the deepest parts of his character. The moral dilemmas intensified. When Alexander asked James to confront his own biases, he was presented with situations where societal assumptions, stereotypes, and prejudices were hidden within seemingly simple tasks. James had to recognize these traps, make choices based on fairness, and resist the easy path of judgment or convenience. It was mentally and emotionally draining. But James began to understand the subtle complexity of leadership, influence, and the responsibility that came with power. He was learning lessons that went far beyond money or social status, lessons about empathy, ethics, and humanity itself. Even as he faced these challenges, James watched Mia thrive. She attended a private school funded by Alexander's resources, received excellent medical care, and had access to experiences and opportunities that were once unimaginable. Yet he also noticed subtle changes in himself. The man who had once been solely focused on survival and immediate needs now had to think strategically, ethically, and long-term. He had to balance love for his daughter with responsibility toward others, carefully navigating a world full of moral complexity. James realized that Alexander's plan was not just about testing him, it was about preparing him for a new life. A life in which his choices had far-reaching consequences. Throughout this journey, James also learned about trust and human connection. He observed how people responded to kindness, honesty, and leadership. He witnessed the impact of decisions, both positive and negative, and saw how fragile and precious life could be. The moral challenges were relentless, but they shaped him, refining his character and fortifying his resolve. James began to see himself not just as a father protecting his child, but as a man capable of influencing the lives of many others, with the power to create meaningful change. Yet even with all this growth, uncertainty loomed. Alexander never revealed the full purpose of the plan, leaving James with questions that gnawed at him. What was the ultimate goal? How far would the challenges go? And what price might he ultimately have to pay for his participation? Despite these doubts, James pressed on, guided by love for Mia, faith in his own principles, and a growing sense of responsibility. He had come to understand that the path Alexander had laid before him was not easy, but it was necessary. By the end of this phase, James Carter was no longer the same man who had walked into Alexander Whitmore's office months earlier. He had faced moral dilemmas, ethical challenges, and intense personal struggles. He had made choices that tested his integrity, challenged his instincts, and reshaped his understanding of right and wrong. Yet through it all, he had remained true to himself, steadfast in his love for Mia, and committed to doing what he believed was right. James realized that the journey was far from over, but he had grown stronger, wiser, and more resilient. He was prepared for whatever Alexander's next test might bring, knowing that the stakes were higher than ever and that the decisions he made could change not only his life but the lives of everyone around him. After months of grueling challenges, moral dilemmas, and life-changing experiences, James Carter found himself standing at the edge of a moment he had never imagined. Alexander Whitmore had been guiding him through situations that tested his integrity, his courage, and his patience. And through it all, James had remained steadfast, determined to protect Mia and stay true to his principles. Yet even as he completed each task, there was an underlying tension, an unspoken question that James could not shake. What was Alexander's ultimate goal? What had he truly been preparing James for? The final stage of Alexander's plan began on a crisp morning. With James arriving at the billionaire's office, unsure of what awaited him, Alexander greeted him with a calm, almost serene expression and asked him to sit. Unlike before, there were no assignments, no subtle tests to navigate, just a quiet, intense focus. Alexander began to speak, explaining the truth behind everything that had happened. The billionaire revealed that Mia's treatment and James's participation in the tests were part of a larger experimenta. Study not only of human behavior but of potential leadership, compassion, and morality under pressure. Alexander had been seeking individuals who could balance immense personal responsibility with empathy and ethical judgment. People capable of making difficult choices without compromising their values. James listened, stunned. All this time, he had thought he was participating in community projects and exercises designed to help others. But he had been part of a larger plan, one that would determine whether he was capable of wielding influence responsibly in a world full of power and opportunity. Alexander explained that the initiative was global, aimed at reshaping how the wealthy and influential could interact with society, creating systems that prioritized ethical decision-making, fairness, and real-world impact. James realized that he had been tested not only for himself, but for the potential to become a leader in this unprecedented project. As Alexander spoke, James reflected on everything he had experienced, the families he had helped, the moral decisions he had faced, the moments when he had felt unsure and afraid. He realized that every challenge had been meticulously crafted to reveal his character, to show how he responded when stakes were high and choices were difficult. James understood now that the billionaire's plan was not meant to manipulate or control him, but to identify someone who could make a real difference, someone whose decisions were guided by conscience, compassion, and courage. Even with this revelation, James faced a new dilemma. Alexander's proposal came with opportunities and responsibilities unlike anything James had ever encountered. He could join the global initiative and take on a role where his choices would influence countless lives. The program promised immense resources, access to networks of influence, and the ability to make long-lasting change. Yet, James also realized that such power came with pressure, scrutiny, and personal sacrifice. He would have to continue navigating ethical challenges, and his life and Mia's life would be entwined with high-stakes decisions that could affect people on a massive scale. James thought about Mia. Her health was secure, and she had a future full of opportunities thanks to Alexander's interventions. But joining the initiative would require more than just his time and effort. It would demand his judgment, resilience, and constant moral vigilance. He weighed the promise of comfort and influence against the responsibility he would bear. Deep down, he knew that turning down the opportunity might protect his personal life, but it would mean ignoring the chance to make a transformative impact, something he had never imagined possible for himself. After careful consideration, James made his choice. He accepted Alexander's offer, not for fame, wealth, or power, but because he had seen firsthand the difference that responsible, ethical guidance could make in people's lives. He realized that he could help shape systems that prevented suffering, created opportunity, and empowered families like his own to thrive. Alexander's plan had revealed James's true potential, and he felt ready to embrace it, knowing that he could act with integrity and compassion even under immense pressure. The first days of James's involvement in the global initiative were both thrilling and humbling. He found himself collaborating with influential leaders, policymakers, and experts from around the world, all focused on creating ethical systems for societal improvement. James contributed his perspective as a single father who had struggled, fought, and survived against all odds. His voice, once limited to the small apartment he shared with Mia, now carried weight on an international stage. Yet every decision he made reminded him of the lessons Alexander had imparted: the importance of empathy, fairness, and the courage to act rightly, even when the choice was difficult. Through this experience, James learned that leadership was not about control or recognition, it was about responsibility. Every choice he made affected real lives, and he had to balance immediate needs against long-term impact. He saw how policies, resources, and guidance could transform communities, and he realized that the principles he had relied on while caring for Mia, the same principles that guided him during Alexander's tests, were now his greatest tools. His growth was profound, and he understood that the journey he had endured had prepared him for this new world, equipping him with resilience, wisdom, and perspective that could never be taught in a classroom. Mia, meanwhile, continued to thrive. She blossomed in an environment of care, stability, and opportunity, excelling in her studies and exploring her passions. James watched her with pride and gratitude, knowing that the risks he had taken and the choices he had made had secured a future she deserved. Yet he also understood that her life was now intertwined with the responsibilities and ethical challenges he had chosen to embrace. Every step he took was a lesson in accountability, a reminder that the well-being of those he loved and countless others depended on the strength of his character. Over time, James also began to recognize the subtler lessons of Alexander's plan. He learned patience, resilience, and the value of observation, understanding people, anticipating challenges, and responding thoughtfully rather than impulsively. He discovered that the greatest influence did not come from wealth or power alone, but from consistent, ethical action and the courage to make difficult decisions. These insights shaped James not only as a father and mentor, but as a human being capable of leading with integrity in a complex and often unforgiving world. As months passed, James and Alexander developed a mutual respect. Alexander's initial secrecy and mysterious methods had given way to mentorship and collaboration. James came to see that Alexander's shocking plan, the tests, the moral dilemmas, the subtle challenges had been designed not to control him, but to reveal his true character and prepare him for responsibility on a scale he had never imagined. The billionaire's intervention, which had once seemed almost surreal, was now understood as a catalyst for transformation, guiding James from a man desperate to save his daughter to someone capable of shaping the lives of many. In the end, James realized that the most profound outcome of the entire journey was not just Mia's survival or the opportunities that it opened for them, but the transformation within himself. He had emerged stronger, wiser, and more compassionate, ready to navigate the world with courage and integrity. Alexander's plan had been shocking, yes, but it had also been life-changing, teaching James that even in a world of wealth, influence, and hidden agendas, the human heart, the choices we make, the values we hold, and the love we give remained the most powerful force of all. James looked at Mia one evening as she played in the sunlit garden of their new home, laughter spilling into the warm air, and he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had faced fear, uncertainty, and moral challenge, yet he had stayed true to his principles. The journey had been long and difficult, filled with tests, revelations, unimaginable experiences, but it had also been extraordinary. In the end, James understood that life's true victories were measured not just by survival or success, but by the courage to act rightly, the wisdom to choose with integrity, and the love that guides every decision. And as he stood there watching Mia's joy, James knew that he had not only saved his daughter's life but had discovered a purpose far greater than he had ever dreamed, a purpose that would guide him, and perhaps the world, for years to come.